Garrett wiped the grease from his hands and stood back to admire his work. The engine of his old cargo hauler hummed smoothly now, finally fixed after 3 days of tinkering. He ran a small repair shop on the edge of the frontier colonies, making enough to get by and help his younger sister Beth with her medical bills. It was honest work, and he liked it that way. The communicator on his workbench buzzed. Garrett ignored it at first, figuring it was another customer calling about a broken speeder. But it kept buzzing, insistent and annoying. When he finally picked it up, his stomach dropped. The royal seal glowed on the screen. "This is Hunter Garrett," a crisp voice asked. "Yeah, that's me. Haven't gone by that name in years though. His Majesty King Henry requests your immediate presence at the palace. Transportation has been arranged. A shuttle will arrive at your location within the hour." The line went dead before Garrett could respond. He stared at the communicator, his mind racing. The king didn't summon retired hunters unless something had gone very wrong. He thought about ignoring it, but you didn't say no to the king. Not if you wanted to keep breathing. The shuttle arrived exactly on time, sleek and expensive, completely out of place in his dusty neighborhood. His neighbors watched from their windows as he climbed aboard, still wearing his work clothes. The pilot said nothing during the flight, and Garrett spent the time wondering what kind of trouble he was walking into. The palace made his repair shop look like a garbage heap. Everything gleamed, from the marble floors to the gold trim on the walls. Servants in fancy uniforms rushed past carrying trays and documents. Garrett felt like a stain on expensive furniture as guards escorted him through hallways that seemed to go on forever. The throne room was even worse. Massive columns reached up to a ceiling painted with scenes of ancient battles. King Henry sat on a throne that probably cost more than Garrett would make in 10 lifetimes. Around him stood advisors in robes that looked uncomfortable and pretentious. "Garrett the Hunter," King Henry announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Your reputation precedes you. They say you tracked the shadow cats of Epsilon Prime for 6 months without losing the trail. That you brought down the razor wolves terrorizing the mining colonies on Tertius 4. That was a long time ago, Your Majesty. I'm just a mechanic now." "Once a hunter, always a hunter," said one of the advisors, a thin man with calculating eyes who introduced himself as Richard. "We have a problem that requires your particular skills." King Henry leaned forward, his expression grave. "An ancient dragon has taken residence in the Frost Peak Mountains. The northern settlements are suffering. Livestock disappearing in the night. 3 travelers have vanished in the past month. The people are terrified to leave their homes." Garrett's instincts started tingling. Ancient dragons were rare, and they didn't act like common predators. They were intelligent, some said as smart as humans. They didn't waste energy on random attacks. Have there been any witnesses? Anyone who actually saw the dragon attacking? Richard stepped forward quickly. "The evidence speaks for itself. Empty pastures, missing people, massive claw marks on the rocks. What more proof do you need?" "I'm just asking questions. That's part of tracking." King Henry raised his hand, silencing Richard. "Fair enough. No, we have no direct witnesses. But the pattern is clear. The creature must be eliminated before more lives are lost." Another advisor, a heavy man named Thomas, pulled out a data tablet. "We've marked the last known location. The Frost Peak Range, Northern Sector. Several previous hunters have accepted the contract. None returned. And you think I'll be different?" "We're willing to pay differently," King Henry said. 300,000 credits upon proof of the kill. Plus a noble title and lands for your family. Your sister's medical treatments would be covered for life." Garrett's breath caught. That kind of money would change everything. Beth could get the surgery she needed, the kind that wasn't covered by basic colonial healthcare. She could live a normal life instead of being stuck in that tiny apartment, too weak to work. But something still felt wrong. The way Richard watched him, like a merchant sizing up a buyer. The way Thomas kept glancing at the king nervously. Ancient dragons were valuable, their scales worth fortunes on the black market. Dead dragons were worth even more. "Why me specifically?" Garrett asked. "There are younger hunters, people still in the game." "Because you have a conscience," King Henry said simply. "Your record shows you never took unnecessary kills. You tracked, you studied, you made sure the target was actually dangerous before pulling the trigger. That's rare in this business." It was a good answer, maybe too good. But Garrett thought of Beth in her apartment, barely able to climb the stairs to her bedroom. He thought of the medical bills piling up, the treatments they couldn't afford. "I'll need 3 days to prepare. Full access to your data archives on dragons, and a ship capable of handling mountain weather. Done, King Henry said immediately. Richard will provide everything you need. As Garrett left the throne room, Richard caught up with him in the hallway. A word of advice, Hunter. This isn't a tracking job. The dragon is dangerous, confirmed killer. Don't overthink it. Get in, eliminate the threat, get paid. Simple. Nothing about ancient dragons is simple, Garrett replied. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then I suppose you'll earn your money the hard way. The coordinates are being loaded into your ship now. Good hunting. Garrett spent the next 2 days in the Royal Archives, reading everything available about dragons. Most of it was useless, legends and superstition mixed with bad science. But a few reports from xenobiologists painted a different picture. Ancient dragons were territorial but not aggressive. They formed bonds with their young that lasted decades. They remembered kindness and cruelty with equal clarity. On the third morning, Garrett stood in the spaceport looking at the ship they'd provided. It was military grade, equipped with weapons he didn't plan to use and survival gear he definitely would need. His personal kit sat by his feet, tools of the hunting trade he'd sworn he was done with. An old veteran named Frank approached, leaning on his cane. Heard you're going after the Frost Peak dragon. That's a death sentence, boy. Probably. But the money's good. Money doesn't spend well when you're dead. 3 hunters before you took that contract. Smart people, experienced. None came back. Maybe they weren't as careful as I am. Frank shook his head. Or maybe there's something up there that doesn't want to be found. Something worth protecting. You ever think about that? Garrett had thought about it. He'd thought about little else. But Beth's face kept appearing in his mind, pale and tired, trying to smile when he visited. I have to go, he said quietly. Then go careful. And remember, the most dangerous hunts are the ones where you're not sure who the real predator is. The ship lifted off at dawn, climbing through the atmosphere toward the frozen peaks in the north. Garrett sat in the pilot's seat, watching the world shrink below him. Somewhere up in those mountains was an ancient dragon, supposedly killing without reason. But Garrett's instincts screamed that nothing about this job was what it seemed. He was about to find out just how right those instincts were. The Frost Peaks earned their name honestly. Garrett's ship shuddered as it pushed through walls of wind and ice, the sensors screaming warnings about the dangerous conditions. He'd flown through asteroid fields that felt safer than this. After 20 minutes of fighting the storm, he gave up and landed the ship in a narrow valley, securing it between 2 rock formations. The rest would have to be on foot. Garrett pulled on his thermal gear and checked his equipment one last time. The tracker showed faint heat signatures higher up the mountain, too large to be anything but the dragon. He shouldered his pack and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath even through the insulated suit. For 3 days he climbed. The wind never stopped, and the snow never let up. He followed tracks, massive imprints in the ice that could only belong to something enormous. Along the way he found disturbing signs. Blast marks on rocks that looked like weapon fire. Pieces of scaled hide that had been cut away, not torn naturally. Someone else had been up here recently, and they'd come armed for war. On the 3rd day, the cave appeared through the white curtain of falling snow. The entrance was huge, easily large enough to fly a small ship through. The edges were worn smooth by centuries of use, and strange markings covered the stone. Not random scratches but deliberate carvings, almost like writing. Garrett activated his helmet light and moved inside, weapon ready. The temperature rose immediately once he was out of the wind. The cave opened into a massive chamber, and what he saw stopped him cold. Glowing crystals grew from the walls and ceiling, casting everything in a soft blue light. They were beautiful, like stars trapped in stone. But Garrett barely noticed them. His attention fixed on the center of the chamber where the ancient dragon lay. She was bigger than his ship. Silver scales covered her body, each one the size of a dinner plate. Her wings were folded against her sides, and her long neck curved across the stone floor. This should have been a creature of terrible beauty, something out of legends. Instead, she looked like she'd been through a war and lost. Deep wounds covered her body. Scales had been torn away, leaving raw flesh exposed. Burn marks scorched her wings, the kind that came from plasma weapons, not natural fire. Crystallized blood pooled beneath her, glittering in the light from the cave walls. This wasn't an animal that had been defending itself from frightened farmers. This was an execution attempt that had somehow failed. The dragon's eye opened. It was massive, golden, and fixed directly on Garrett. He froze, finger on the trigger of his weapon. She could kill him in seconds, even wounded. One swipe of those claws, one blast of fire, and he'd be done. But she didn't move. She just watched him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. This wasn't a mindless beast. There was a person behind those eyes, someone thinking and judging and deciding whether he was a threat. Garrett slowly lowered his weapon. The dragon's eye followed the movement, but she remained still, breathing slowly and carefully like every breath hurt. That's when he heard it. A sound so unexpected it took him a moment to process what it was. Crying. High-pitched and desperate, coming from deeper in the cave. Not one voice but multiple, calling out over and over. The dragon's massive head lifted slightly at the sound. Her eye closed for a long moment, and when it opened again, Garrett could have sworn he saw pain there that had nothing to do with her wounds. "You've got babies in here," Garrett said quietly, more to himself than to the dragon. The eye focused on him with sudden intensity. The dragon made a low sound, not aggressive but almost pleading. Then she slowly, painfully, lowered her head back to the stone. Garrett's mind raced. Ancient dragons were fiercely protective of their young. They'd die before letting anything threaten their children. This dragon was severely wounded, barely able to move, but she was still here. Still trying to protect them. He walked slowly around her, giving her space. She tracked him with her eyes but didn't move. As he passed her side, he got a better look at the wounds. These weren't random injuries from a fight. They were surgical, precise. Someone had been trying to harvest her scales while she was still alive. The realization made him sick. The crying grew louder as he moved deeper into the cave. A smaller chamber opened up, warmer than the main cavern. In the center sat a nest made of soft moss, shed scales, and what looked like salvaged cloth. 3 baby dragons huddled together, each about the size of a large dog. They were beautiful. Their scales shimmered with different colors, catching the crystal light. One was silver like its mother, another had hints of blue, and the third showed touches of deep red. Their eyes were barely open, and they couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. When they sensed Garrett, they cried louder, stretching their tiny necks toward him. They thought he might be their mother, coming to feed them or comfort them. When they realized he wasn't, their cries turned to frightened chirps. "Easy there, little ones," Garrett said softly, keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you." He returned to the main chamber, his thoughts churning. The mother dragon watched him approach. She'd managed to drag herself closer to the nursery entrance while he was gone, positioning herself between him and her babies even though it must have caused her incredible pain. Garrett sat down on a boulder, far enough away not to threaten her, close enough to talk. He knew she probably couldn't understand his words, but something about her eyes made him feel like she might understand his intent. "Someone tried to kill you," he said. "They cut you up, burned you, and left you to die. But you survived because you had to. Because those babies need you." The dragon's eye closed once, slowly. Almost like a nod. "The king sent me here to finish the job. Told me you were terrorizing settlements, killing livestock, attacking travelers. But that's garbage, isn't it? You've been up here the whole time, protecting your young. Someone else has been causing trouble down below, making sure you take the blame." The pieces clicked together in his mind. The missing livestock were probably stolen by poachers and sold on the black market. The missing travelers might have been unfortunate witnesses who saw too much. And the dragon scales he'd seen scattered outside, those were worth a fortune. This wasn't about protecting settlements. This was about money. Someone had tried to kill this dragon to harvest her and her babies. When that failed, they'd convinced the king to send a hunter to finish the job. Clean, simple, and profitable. Garrett pulled out his communicator and checked the signal. Nothing. The mountains blocked everything. He was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with a dying dragon and 3 helpless babies. If he left now to report what he'd found, the dragon might die before he could return. The babies would starve. And whoever set this up would have time to cover their tracks. If he stayed and tried to help, he was defying a direct order from the king. He'd never get paid, and Beth would never get her treatment. The dragon made a soft sound, breaking into his thoughts. She was looking at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and slowly, carefully, she extended her massive head toward him. She moved so gently despite her size, stretching across the stone until her snout was just a few feet away. Then she did something that shocked him to his core. She lowered her head and gently pressed it against his shoulder. Not hard enough to hurt, just a touch. A gesture that transcended species. It was a plea, parent to parent, asking him to protect what she couldn't. Garrett reached up and placed his hand on her scales. They were warm and smooth, nothing like the rough texture he'd expected. "All right," he said quietly. I'll help you. But first we need to keep you alive. Those babies need their mom, and I'm going to need your testimony to prove what really happened here. The dragon's eye closed again, and her breathing seemed to steady slightly. She understood. Somehow, across the gap between species, she understood that he was choosing to help instead of harm. Garrett stood and walked back to retrieve his medical supplies. This was going to be the hardest job of his life. But as he passed the nursery and heard those tiny voices calling, he knew it was also the most important. Garrett stood in the nursery chamber, looking down at 3 pairs of eyes that stared back at him with a mixture of fear and hope. The baby dragons had stopped crying for the moment, watching him with intense curiosity. The silver one tilted its head, studying him the same way a puppy might examine a new person. Your mom's in bad shape, Garrett said softly, knowing they couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. But we're going to fix that. The little red-tinted one chirped and took a wobbly step toward him. Its legs weren't quite steady yet, and it stumbled, catching itself with its tiny wings. Garrett felt something twist in his chest. These weren't monsters. They were babies, completely helpless and dependent on a mother who was dying in the next room. He returned to the main chamber and really examined the dragon's wounds for the first time. The cuts were precise, made by someone who knew exactly where to slice to get the most valuable scales without killing her immediately. They'd wanted her alive during the harvest, probably because fresh scales were worth more than ones taken from a corpse. The thought made his blood boil. The dragon watched him as he unpacked his medical kit. It was designed for large animals, meant for treating injured livestock or wounded beasts. He'd never imagined using it on something this massive, but the principles were the same. Stop the bleeding, prevent infection, and give the body time to heal. This is going to hurt, Garrett warned, pulling out a canister of medical foam. But if I don't seal these wounds, you're going to die. And those babies need you. The dragon's eye focused on him, and she made a low rumbling sound deep in her chest. Then she deliberately laid her head flat on the stone and closed her eyes. She was giving him permission, trusting him not to finish what the poachers had started. Garrett worked carefully, spraying the foam into the deepest wounds. The dragon's muscles tensed, and her claws scraped against stone, but she didn't pull away. The foam expanded and hardened, creating a temporary seal that would prevent further blood loss. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep her alive. Hours passed. Garrett moved from wound to wound, using every bit of medical knowledge he'd gained from years of tracking and treating injured animals. The dragon remained still except for the occasional shudder when he hit a particularly painful spot. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool temperature. His hands cramped from the detailed work, but he didn't stop. Finally, he stepped back. The dragon looked like she'd been patched together with white foam and synthetic bandages, but her breathing had steadied. The crystallized blood had stopped spreading across the floor. That's all I can do for now, Garrett said, exhaustion hitting him like a wave. You need water and food, and you need rest. As if understanding, the dragon's eye opened and focused on the nursery chamber. The babies had started crying again, their voices weak and desperate. They are hungry too, Garrett realized. When's the last time they ate? The dragon tried to lift her head but couldn't manage it. She made a sound that was almost a whimper, and Garrett understood. She'd been too injured to hunt. The babies hadn't eaten in days. All right, I'm on it. Just rest. Garrett grabbed his hunting rifle and headed back out into the blizzard. The storm had eased slightly, enough that he could see more than a few feet ahead. He spotted tracks in the snow, some kind of mountain goat from the looks of it. The dragons probably fed on them regularly. It took him 3 hours to track down a herd and take down 2 of the animals. Dragging them back to the cave nearly killed him, but he managed. The baby dragons went crazy when he hauled the carcasses into the nursery, chirping and stumbling over each other to get close. They tore into the meat with tiny teeth, making sounds of contentment. The mother dragon watched from the main chamber, and for the first time since Garrett had arrived, she looked at peace. Her young were safe and fed. That was all that mattered to her. Over the next 2 days, Garrett fell into a rhythm. He'd hunt in the mornings, bringing back food for the dragons. He'd check the mother's wounds, changing bandages and applying fresh medicine. The babies grew bolder, investigating his equipment and trying to play with anything that moved. The red-tinted one developed a fascination with his boots and kept trying to steal them. You're going to be trouble when you grow up, Garrett told her, gently pushing her away from his gear for the 5th time that hour. But as the mother dragon improved, reality crept back in. Garrett sat outside the cave on the 3rd night, staring at the stars between breaks in the clouds. He'd defied the king's orders. He'd spent days helping the target he was supposed to kill. And he still had no proof of who was really behind the attacks on the settlements. If he went back empty-handed, King Henry would send an army. They'd storm this cave with weapons meant to kill dragons, and nothing Garrett said would stop them. The poachers would probably volunteer to lead the attack, making sure no witnesses survived. If he went back claiming the dragon was dead, he'd get his money and Beth would get her treatment. But the poachers would come for the babies. Dragon scales were worth fortunes, and baby dragons couldn't defend themselves. They'd be harvested and sold piece by piece. The only other option was to stay here forever, protecting the dragons himself. But that wasn't realistic. He'd run out of supplies eventually. Winter was coming, and these mountains would be impassable for months. He and the dragons would all starve. Garrett dropped his head into his hands. There had to be a fourth option, something he wasn't seeing. A sound made him look up. The mother dragon had dragged herself to the cave entrance, moving easier now that the wounds had started healing. She settled beside him, her massive body radiating warmth that cut through the cold night air. "I don't know what to do," Garrett admitted. "I want to help you, but I don't know how to fight the people who did this. They have money and power, and I'm just one person." The dragon made a low sound and turned her head to look back into the cave where the babies were sleeping. Then she looked at Garrett, and he saw the question in her eyes. It was the same question any parent would ask when they were out of options and desperate. "Will you protect them?" Garrett thought about Beth waiting for him back home. He thought about the money he'd been promised and the life it could buy. Then he thought about 3 baby dragons who'd done nothing wrong except be born valuable. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll protect them. But I'm going to need your help to pull this off. We can't just hide up here. We need to prove who really attacked you and who's been causing trouble in the settlements. We need evidence that even the king can't ignore." The dragon's eye gleamed in the starlight. She understood. And somehow, Garrett knew she'd help him however she could. He stood and pulled out his communicator. Still no signal, but that gave him an idea. He returned to his ship the next morning and powered up the communication array. It took hours of work, but he managed to boost the signal enough to punch through the mountain interference. Then he started digging. He hacked into commercial networks, tracking cargo manifests and financial records. He followed digital trails that led to encrypted marketplaces where illegal goods were sold. And slowly, piece by piece, he found what he needed. Messages between poachers discussing their attack on the dragon. Coordinates for the cave that matched this location exactly. Financial transactions showing payments to certain members of the king's court. And most damning of all, recorded conversations where they discussed their plan to frame the dragon and use a royal hunter to finish the job. Richard's voice came through crystal clear on one recording. "Once the hunter confirms the kill, we move in and harvest the babies. 3 young dragons will set us up for life. The king will never know the difference." Garrett saved everything, creating multiple backups. This was his ammunition, the proof that could save the dragons and expose the people who tried to murder them for profit. But he still had to figure out how to get this information to someone who'd actually do something about it. If he sent it to the wrong person, it would disappear and he'd probably have an accident before making it back to civilization. He needed someone trustworthy, someone whose loyalty to the king was beyond question. Captain Laura Stevens. Head of the king's personal guard. Garrett had heard stories about her, how she turned down bribes that could have made her rich, how she'd arrested her own cousin for corruption. If anyone would act on this information, it would be her. Garrett encrypted the files and prepared to send them. But before he hit transmit, he looked back at the cave where the dragons waited. This was the point of no return. Once he sent this, everything would change. He'd be accusing members of the king's court of attempted murder and conspiracy. If he was wrong about Stevens, if she was part of the conspiracy, he'd be signing his own death warrant. The red baby dragon appeared at the cave entrance, chirping at him. She'd followed him down to the ship, curious as always. She stumbled through the snow and sat down next to his leg, looking up at him with complete trust. Garrett took a deep breath and hit send. The message disappeared into the encrypted network, and Garrett sat in his ship staring at the empty screen. There was no taking it back now. Either Captain Stevens would receive his evidence and act on it, or the wrong people would intercept it and he'd have a kill squad heading his way within days. The red baby dragon chirped beside him, oblivious to the danger they were all in. She'd started following him everywhere, her little claws clicking on the metal floor of the ship. Garrett had given up trying to keep her in the cave. She was too curious for her own good. "Come on, Trouble," he said, scooping her up. She weighed about 30 pounds now, heavier than when he'd first arrived. "Let's get back to your mom before she worries." The dragon made a happy sound and tried to chew on his collar. Her teeth were still small, more annoying than dangerous. Garrett wondered what she'd be like in a few years when those teeth could bite through steel. Back in the cave, the mother dragon was standing. Actually standing, not just lying on the ground trying to survive. It had been a week since Garrett first found her, and the improvement was remarkable. She still moved carefully, and the wounds were far from healed, but she was getting stronger every day. The other two babies rushed over when they saw their sister, and the three of them tumbled together in a pile of scales and wings. The mother dragon watched them with what Garrett could only describe as affection. Then she turned to him and made a deep rumbling sound. "You're welcome," Garrett said, understanding that she was thanking him. She moved closer, lowering her massive head until they were almost eye to eye. Then she did something unexpected. She opened her mouth slightly and breathed out, very gently. Warm air washed over Garrett, carrying a smell like cinnamon and smoke. It wasn't unpleasant, and he realized she was sharing her scent with him, marking him as part of her family group. The baby dragons immediately perked up and rushed over, breathing their own tiny puffs of warm air at him. They couldn't produce fire yet, but they were trying. Garrett laughed despite everything, the sound echoing through the cave. All right, I get it. I'm part of the family now." But family didn't pay Beth's medical bills. Family didn't explain to the king why his hunter had been gone for over a week with no results. And family definitely didn't protect them from the poachers who would eventually come looking. Garrett spent the next 3 days teaching himself everything he could about the poaching operation. He used his ship's computer to track their movements through commercial shipping records. They were careful, but not careful enough. A pattern emerged of shipments leaving the planet every 2 weeks, always from the same private spaceport, always heading to black market trading stations in the outer colonies. The next shipment was scheduled for 5 days from now. That would be when they were most vulnerable, when they'd have physical evidence of their crimes loaded and ready to transport. If Garrett could somehow get the authorities to raid that shipment, it would be undeniable proof. But he needed help. He couldn't be in 2 places at once, protecting the dragons and gathering evidence against the poachers. He needed someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't sell him out. His communicator buzzed. Garrett's heart jumped as he checked the screen. Encrypted message, routed through 7 different relays to hide its origin. He opened it with shaking hands. Evidence received and verified. Appalled by what I found. King Henry has not been informed yet, awaiting your return with physical proof. Trust no one at court except me. 3 advisors are compromised, possibly more. Return safely. We will be ready. Captain L. Stevens. Garrett let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Stevens had received the files and believed them. More importantly, she was smart enough not to show her hand too early. If she'd arrested Richard and Thomas immediately, the rest of the conspiracy would have scattered like rats. But she wanted physical proof, something beyond digital files that could theoretically be faked. She wanted him to bring back evidence that couldn't be disputed. The mother dragon sensed his tension and came over to investigate. The babies were sleeping in their nest, finally worn out from a day of playing and eating. She made a questioning sound. "We have an ally," Garrett explained, even though he knew she couldn't understand the words. "But we need to be smart about this. The people who hurt you are powerful and connected. If we make one wrong move, they'll bury us all." The dragon rumbled thoughtfully. Then she walked to the back of the cave, to a section Garrett hadn't fully explored yet. She used her snout to push aside some loose rocks, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside were dozens of scales, shed naturally over the years. But more than that, there were fragments of metal, pieces of equipment, and what looked like a damaged recording device. Garrett's eyes widened. "You collected evidence. You knew someone would need proof of what happened." He picked up the recording device carefully. It was damaged but might still have usable data. The metal fragments had serial numbers, the kind that could be traced back to specific buyers. And scattered among it all were spent weapon cartridges, the type used in high-end plasma rifles. "You're brilliant," Garrett said, already planning. "This is exactly what we need." Over the next day, Garrett carefully catalogued everything. He photographed the evidence, recorded serial numbers, and managed to extract partial data from the damaged recorder. It showed 2 men in cold weather gear discussing how to position the dragon for the best scale harvest. Their faces were partially visible, enough for identification. But having evidence wasn't enough. He needed to get it back to the capital without being intercepted. The poachers would be watching for him. Richard and Thomas would be getting nervous about how long he'd been gone. And if they suspected he'd turned against them, they'd make sure he never made it back alive. Garrett sat outside the cave that night, thinking through his options. The baby dragons had followed him out, drawn by the clear sky and the stars. They looked up at the heavens with wonder, instinctively understanding that someday they'd fly up there among the distant lights. The red one climbed into his lap, making herself comfortable. The silver one curled up against his leg. The blue one sat slightly apart, always more independent but still close enough to feel safe. These creatures trusted him completely. They had no idea that human greed had nearly destroyed their family. The mother dragon emerged from the cave and settled behind Garrett, creating a windbreak with her massive body. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. "I have to leave soon," Garrett said quietly. "I need to take this evidence back to the capital and make sure the right people see it. But I'll come back. I promise." The dragon made a sound that might have been understanding or might have been protest. Either way, she knew what was coming. "You'll need to stay hidden while I'm gone. No hunting during the day where someone might see you. Keep the babies inside the cave. Can you do that?" Another rumble, this one more definite. Yes. She could do that. Garrett pulled out his communicator and sent another encrypted message to Captain Stevens. He outlined his plan, the evidence he'd collected, and the timeline for the poacher's next shipment. If everything worked perfectly, he'd arrive back at the capital just as they were loading illegal dragon materials onto a transport ship. The timing would be tight, but it could work. Stevens' reply came an hour later. "Confirmed. We'll have loyal guards ready to move on your signal. The king will be present for the arrests. Make sure you bring the dragon's testimony." Garrett read that last line 3 times. Bring the dragon's testimony. Stevens wanted him to bring the mother dragon back with him. It was a huge risk. If something went wrong, the dragon would be walking into a trap. But Stevens was right. Seeing the wounded dragon in person, hearing her story even without words, would be more powerful than any recording or photograph. He looked up at the massive creature sheltering him from the wind. "She wants you to come with me. To show the king what they did to you. Are you strong enough for that?" The dragon's golden eye fixed on him. Then she looked at her sleeping babies and back at Garrett. The message was clear. She'd do whatever it took to keep them safe, even if it meant leaving them temporarily to face the humans who'd tried to kill her. "Then we leave at dawn," Garrett said. "And we finish this." Dawn came cold and clear over the frost peaks. Garrett stood at the cave entrance, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. Behind him, the mother dragon was saying goodbye to her babies. She made soft rumbling sounds, nuzzling each one carefully. The little dragons chirped and clung to her, not understanding why she was leaving. The red one seemed especially distressed. She kept running between her mother and Garrett, crying loudly. Finally, Garrett knelt down and picked her up. "Your mom will be back soon," he promised. "She's going to make sure nobody ever hurts you again. But you need to stay here and look after your brother and sister. Can you do that?" The baby dragon made a sad sound but seemed to understand. Garrett set her down, and she reluctantly returned to her siblings. The 3 of them huddled together in the nest, watching with frightened eyes as their mother prepared to leave. Getting the dragon to the ship was harder than Garrett expected. She was healing but still weak, and the trek down the mountain exhausted her. Several times she had to stop and rest, her breathing labored. Garrett began to worry they'd made a mistake, that she wasn't ready for this journey. But every time he suggested turning back, the dragon would force herself to stand and continue. She was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. The ship barely fit her. Garrett had to remove most of the cargo space and reconfigure the bay just to make room. Even then, the dragon had to curl up tight, her wings folded against her body. It couldn't have been comfortable, but she didn't complain. 3 hours to the capital, Garrett said, strapping himself into the pilot's seat. "Try to rest." The flight was tense. Garrett kept watching the scanners, expecting to see pursuit ships at any moment. But the skies remained clear. Either the poachers didn't know he was coming, or they were waiting to make their move closer to the capital where they could claim it was an accident. Captain Stevens' voice came through the communicator an hour from landing. "Hunter Garrett, this is Captain Stevens. What's your status?" "On approach with passenger and evidence. Is the welcome party ready?" "Affirmative. The king has been briefed and is waiting. Be advised, Richard and Thomas are in the throne room. They insisted on being present for your report." Garrett smiled grimly. "Perfect. They'll get a report they won't forget." The capital city spread out below them, a sprawl of buildings and lights. Garrett brought the ship down at the royal landing pad, where a squad of guards in the king's colors waited. Captain Stevens stood at their head, her hand resting casually on her weapon. She was a tall woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. As Garrett opened the ship's cargo bay, those eyes widened slightly at the sight of the wounded dragon. "By the stars," she breathed. "They really tried to butcher her." The dragon emerged slowly, wincing with each step. The guards backed away instinctively, hands moving toward weapons. Stevens snapped her fingers. "Stand down. This dragon is under royal protection as of now. Anyone who threatens her answers to me personally." The authority in her voice left no room for argument. The guards relaxed slightly, though they kept watching the dragon with wary respect. "Can she make it to the throne room?" Stevens asked Garrett quietly. "She'll make it. She didn't come all this way to give up now." Word of their arrival spread through the palace like wildfire. Servants and officials lined the hallways, staring in shock as the massive dragon walked past with Garrett at her side. Some whispered in fear, others in wonder. None of them had ever seen an ancient dragon up close before. The throne room doors opened, and Garrett's heart pounded. This was it. Everything came down to the next few minutes. King Henry sat on his throne, looking older than Garrett remembered. Advisors flanked him on both sides, including Richard and Thomas. Both men went pale when they saw the dragon, but they recovered quickly, plastering on expressions of concern. "Your Majesty," Richard said smoothly, "the hunter has clearly been compromised. This beast should have been slain, not brought into your presence. It's dangerous." "The only danger in this room comes from traitors," Garrett said loudly. His voice echoed off the marble walls. "Your Majesty, I was sent to kill a dragon supposedly terrorizing your settlements. But that was a lie. This dragon never attacked anyone. She was the victim." He pulled out the datapad containing all his evidence and handed it to Captain Stevens, who connected it to the room's display system. Images appeared on the walls, showing financial records, intercepted messages, and photographs of the dragon's wounds. "These men," Garrett pointed at Richard and Thomas, "hired poachers to attack this dragon and harvest her scales. When she survived, they manipulated you into sending me to finish the job. They've been stealing livestock and blaming it on her, creating a crisis they could profit from." "Lies!" Thomas shouted. "Your Majesty, you can't believe this. He's been gone for weeks, clearly the isolation has affected his mind." "Then explain these," Stevens said coldly. She played the audio recording of Richard and Thomas discussing their plan to harvest the baby dragons once Garrett confirmed the kill. The voices were crystal clear. Richard's distinctive laugh came through as he talked about how much money they'd make. Thomas described in detail how they divide the profits with their partners in the poaching ring. The color drained from both men's faces. Around the room, guards moved to block the exits. There would be no escape. King Henry stood slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "You used my authority to attempt murder. You corrupted my court and made me an unwitting accomplice to your crimes. Captain Stevens, arrest them." Guards seized Richard and Thomas. They tried to protest, to argue, but Stevens cut them off. "Save it for your trial, where you'll face every citizen whose livestock you stole, every family whose loved ones disappeared because they witnessed your crimes, and the judgment of a king you betrayed." As they were dragged away, the mother dragon moved forward. She approached the throne slowly, and every guard in the room tensed. But she didn't attack. Instead, she lowered her massive head in a gesture of respect, acknowledging King Henry as the leader of his people the same way she was the matriarch of her family. Henry stepped down from his throne and approached the dragon carefully. He reached out and placed his hand on her scarred scales. "I am deeply sorry for what was done to you in my name," he said quietly. "You and your children deserve better. How can I make this right?" The dragon looked at Garrett, and he understood what she wanted. "The Frost Peaks need to become a protected sanctuary," Garrett said. "No hunting, no mining, no settlement. A place where dragons can live without fear. And it needs a warden, someone to make sure the protection is enforced." King Henry nodded slowly. "Done. The Frost Peaks are hereby declared a royal sanctuary, protected by decree. And you, Garrett, will serve as its first warden. You'll have full authority and whatever resources you need." "What about your payment?" Stevens asked. "You were promised 300,000 credits." Garrett thought about Beth and her medical bills. The treatment she desperately needed. But he also thought about 3 baby dragons waiting in a cave, wondering if their mother would return. "Use the credits to fund the sanctuary. But I need one thing. My sister Beth needs surgery. Can the royal physicians help her?" "Consider it done," Henry said immediately. "Your sister will receive the finest care available, at no cost." It's the least I can do. 3 months later, Garrett stood at the entrance to the dragon's cave, watching the mother teach her babies to fly. They'd grown significantly, now the size of horses. The red one, who Garrett had started calling Ruby, was the boldest. She'd dive and swoop, testing her limits, while her siblings took a more cautious approach. The mother dragon had healed well. The scars remained, a permanent reminder of what she'd survived, but she moved with grace and power now. She'd never fully trust humans again, except for Garrett. He'd earned that trust through actions, not words. Ruby spotted him and immediately changed direction, landing with a thump that shook the ground. She'd developed a habit of bringing him gifts, usually fresh kills from her hunts. Today it was a mountain goat, which she dropped proudly at his feet. "Good hunt," Garrett said, scratching under her chin where she liked it. "You're getting better every day." His communicator buzzed. A message from Beth, who was recovering from her surgery in the capital. She'd be able to walk again soon, to live a normal life. She'd sent a picture of herself smiling in her hospital bed, giving him a thumbs up. Garrett smiled and looked up at the dragons playing in the sky. The mother circled overhead once before joining her children in the valley below. She trusted him to watch over them while she taught them to hunt, to fly, to be dragons. He'd come to these mountains as a hunter, ready to kill. Instead, he'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was lower your weapon and extend your hand. That courage wasn't about taking lives, but about protecting them, even when it cost you everything. The sun was setting, painting the peaks in brilliant colors. Ruby settled beside him, content to watch the show with her friend. In the valley below, her mother and siblings played without fear, knowing they were safe. And Garrett realized something important. He'd been searching his whole life for a purpose, for work that mattered. He'd found it here, not by destroying something ancient and beautiful, but by choosing to protect it. Sometimes the most important hunts were the ones where you chose not to pull the trigger. Where you looked at something different and dangerous and decided it deserved to live. Those were the hunts that changed you, that made you understand what it really meant to be human. The dragons called to each other in the fading light, their voices echoing off the mountains. And Garrett answered them, his human voice joining the chorus, a promise that they would never face their enemies alone again.